Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for a New American Security, where we've got Paul Scharre, who heads the Technology Security Program here. You're also a senior fellow. Paul, thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
A lot of things to talk about. Earlier this week, about 100 prominent industrialists and scientists wrote to the United Nations asking for an artificial intelligence sort of rules of the road. Let's consider this as an international community, because there are some concerns about what the negative implications of artificial intelligence are. You know, the upsides are whether it's warfighting or autonomous vehicles, there's a lot of promise there. I'd also like you to talk about your new initiative that you have to study unmanned vehicles. And your book that's also going to be coming out that we talked about some time ago, so that this volume has come together. And full shout out to our digital director Jen Oprahori, who came up with the title of the book that's going to be coming out as well.
Yeah, she had a great suggestion for the title. So the book will be coming out in April by W.W. Norton. It's called Army of None: Autonomous Weapons in the Future of War. Very excited about it. And it delves right into this topic that, as you mentioned, over 100 industrialists signed this letter about this week, calling for the United Nations to be engaged in more discussions about what to do about increasingly autonomous military systems and weapons in particular. And really the overarching question that the book grapples with, that they're talking about, is, what happens when a Predator drone has as much autonomy as a self-driving car? Right? What's the line of how much autonomy do we want in military systems? It's something that the Defense Department's been grappling with for the past several years. General Selva has spoken about this publicly a number of times, expressing concern about how much automation we ought to have and the need for human responsibility in the use of force. And there have been ongoing discussions internationally, but they've been stalled, as international diplomacy does, and it's a slow process. And so this letter, really, that they wrote recently, coming from 100 CEOs of major AI and robotics companies, a lot of it was about the concern, the fact that the UN had decided basically to create a formal group of governmental experts this year to have more sort of significant discussions, but they've been delayed. And there'll be some meetings in November, but it looks like the process is moving very, very slowly internationally and really trying to come together to think about this technology.
And how should they be thinking about the technology? Because you've spent more time than most on this issue, researching it and its implications, both from a warfighting standpoint, but also from a moral standpoint, from a law of war standpoint. What are the kind of guidelines that need to be established, and how do you counter the argument that opponents of such guidelines make, which is the history of war has never been constrained? Knights have been trying since the firearm was invented to sort of set rules-based warfighting, and it ultimately doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the historical record on this is very mixed. And there's enough examples of successes and failures in attempts to control weapons for people to kind of pick whatever examples they want. So for those who say, look, a ban is futile, you can't ban things, they'll look to examples like the Pope's attempt to ban the crossbow in the 12th century, which was an abysmal failure, or attempts in the early 20th century to place rules on how submarines acted in war, or ban air-delivered weapons from hot air balloons and aircraft. And those failed. They didn't work. They might have worked for a very short period of time, but they quickly collapsed in war. But then there are other examples like chemical weapons, blinding lasers, landmines, cluster munitions, biological weapons that have had some successes. They're not maybe entirely eliminated, but there are some examples of successes there. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I think when it comes to automation, the real question we need to be asking is not only about the technology today and what it's capable of, but if we had all the technology we could want, what decisions do we still want humans to make in war? Are there certain decisions in war that we think are uniquely human, and why should that be the case, or why not? And I think it's worth distinguishing between things that have factually correct answers. So is this a tank? Is this an AK-47? Those are places where we can probably make machines do better than humans. And we have a lot of examples of that today with existing artificial intelligence to think that might be possible. And distinguishing that and things that require what we might think of as judgment. So is it appropriate to actually use force in this instance? Or how many civilian deaths are proportional to some military necessity of some target? Those are things that are value judgment based and might be much harder for machines to do. Or even if they could do them, we might decide that we want humans to make those decisions for some reason.
Talk to us a little bit about the program you guys are starting here and what you hope to accomplish.
So we're launching a new research initiative on artificial intelligence and global security. And what we're really looking to do is expand the horizon of how, in the national security space, we're thinking about these emerging technologies beyond just robotics and automation, and talking about what really people in the technology sector are talking about artificial intelligence. Very exciting developments in the past several years, particularly in a lot of companies like non-traditional defense companies, right? Companies like Google and Microsoft and Apple and other places, where we've seen really tremendous developments in artificial intelligence. And it's not the kind of AI you think of in science fiction where machines are sort of becoming alive and self-aware, but it's very powerful machine intelligence to solve very discrete problems. We've seen this in certain examples in gaming, like chess, Go, poker, as being Jeopardy, things that have been tackled in relatively recent years. Chess 20 years ago, but these other things very recently. And there are a lot of other applications across a range of industries and also national security. And so we're trying to really kind of grapple through what are these applications and how do we think about something that might look like another industrial revolution and what are the implications of that for thinking about global security.
And tell us a little bit about the book.
Yeah, so very excited about the book. Book will be delving into the technology of autonomous weapons and also the legal and ethical and policy issues. Really what countries are doing around the globe, in the United States and others, in Russia in particular, is doing a lot of things with weaponized robotic systems. And how are countries beginning to think through some of these challenges? How do their cultural perspectives influence maybe decisions that I might make about automation? But really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of explaining this technology. When we say autonomous weapon, what do we mean? What exists today? What's being developed in labs? And then what are the places where, what does the law tell us? What does ethics tell us? What are these these tricky issues that we start to grapple with what the technology means and what we might do going forward?
And who is, from your standpoint, after studying this, who are guys that the United States should be most worried about in terms of how they plan to use automation? Because the United States is still using governors on, for example, what is acceptable use, what isn't. Whereas friends of mine, for example, who look at what China and a little bit to an extent what Russia are doing, are regarding countries that are far less constrained by moral squeamishness or convention, for example, than we might be.
Yeah, so China's been pretty quiet about what they're doing. They recently published a report on artificial intelligence. But in terms of specifically autonomous weapons, we know that they're building a variety of next generation drones, but they haven't talked public about what they intend. Russia's been very different. They have very vocally said, we're going to build fully robotic units. We're going to deploy them on the battlefield. Earlier this summer, a Russian robotics arms manufacturer said that they had built an autonomous weapon. Now, is that actually true? Can it actually target on its own? It's not clear, but they don't seem to have any problems claiming that. The dialogue there is just very different than what you hear, say, out of the Pentagon, where there are those concerns about policy and ethics. And so I think that's a very valid concern going forward. I think one of the challenges for the United States is what does that mean for us? Sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction of, well, we have to do it too. And there are certainly cases where that might be the case, where speed compels you to think more about automation. But just because Russia or China does something doesn't mean it's a great idea. We also want to think about resiliency in our forces, safety in our forces, and how do we think about managing and controlling automation to make sure that we're still in control of the things we're putting on the battlefield.
And what are some other key takeaways of the book? What do you want people to walk away with, understanding after reading it?
Really a better sense of how to think about the technology, what's being developed, what people around the world are doing, and then kind of what are the implications of some of the law and the ethics and the policy things going forward in terms of what are the choices that we have as a country and then internationally.
Paul, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.